Number 7.
Just
Just to prove I was here.
There's a map. Number 7. Should be 7.
Thanks.
We're live.
So, good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 24th, 2023. It's 10 a.m. We're continuing our work on S5, also known as the Affordable Heat Act. And we have some witnesses to hear from this morning and then time for committee discussion. So with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Fingus to join us at the table. Thanks so much for making the trip. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks so much. I will just dive right in. I think I've met all of you before, so nice to see you all.
Yeah, why don't, we haven't done this for a couple weeks, so
Okay.
the people at home who may be tuning in, and why don't we introduce ourselves, starting with Senator White.
Rebecca White, Windsor County.
Senator Martin,
Senator Sprague, Addison Senate District.
Senator Ann Watson, Washington District.
Dick McCormick, Windsor County.
All right. Well, thank you, Chair Bray and members of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee for having me here today to testify about S5, the Affordable Heat Act. My name is Dan Fingus, and I'm the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy, which we call RAD. RAD is a member-led organization that started in 2016 that organizes in communities across Vermont and New Hampshire. Our mission is to bring people together to take action to build healthy communities and make the values of our communities guide the policies of our government. We are building a popular movement to advance rights and build a real democracy. We work in partnership with community groups, progressive unions, faith communities, organizations fighting for human and civil rights, and environmental and climate action groups. RAD believes that Vermont must do its part to ensure a just transition to a clean energy future and mandates renewable energy and ends our reliance on dirty, polluting fossil fuels. And we must guarantee that everyone benefits, especially Vermonters who have been most impacted by past and current harm. We need a full transition to renewables with a focus on locally and community-owned in-state sources and a clean heat standard that centers equity and incentivizes energy use mitigation over transition fuels. With this context, we feel that S5, the Affordable Heat Act, is a better bill than last year's Clean Heat Act and should be passed by the legislature this year. It's no secret that RAD was not in favor of the passage of the Clean Heat Standard bill last year. So we appreciate the hard work that many have done to create a better bill that is more affordable, more equitable for all Vermonters. I first want to highlight what RAD sees as some of the key improvements to S5. Firstly, we were excited to see that the equity and affordability are a main focus of this bill. This includes setting specific targets for transition and mitigation for low and moderate income Vermont households. We also appreciate the following improvements to the bill. A transition that is based on declining carbon intensity in a clear and measurable manner, moving to a carbon intensity score of 20 or below by 2050. An improved accounting system of life cycle emissions that is fit to Vermont specifically, and how it expressly looks at the fuel pathway from cradle to grave. How it focuses on accounting for fugitive emissions. How it creates baseline emissions for methane that is based on methane capture regulations, and requires review of consequences by the PUC to ensure that the standard is working as designed. We also appreciate that it explicitly lists listing of better solutions, including weatherization, heat pumps, solar, and geothermal. While RAD truly believes that this bill is better and should be passed, we also feel that there are ways that we can improve this bill and hope that the committee looks closely at these issues as they continue their committee debate and bill writing. First is to ensure that affordability for low-income Vermont households is the real outcome of this bill. We need to ensure that we are protecting the most needy Vermont households and ensure a just transition. That means we are ensuring that $0 out-of-pocket options are available to all low-income Vermonters, and that they are prioritized first to get that mitigation work done quickly to see the cost benefit of the work. This needs to include a strong focus on renters. We believe that programs like RAP and other tariff on-bill financing measures are effective ways to meet this need if all renters are included. With these elements, we echo the testimony provided by Mara Collins from the Vermont Housing Finance Authority agency last week. We also think that clarification in 8124 subpoint D number 2 to ensure that 50% of both low and moderate income credits are through mitigation. The current language is a little vague and seems to only require that 50% of low and moderate as a whole. And so where it says 16% for low and 16%, making sure the half is for both those pieces and not just for the 32% altogether. Our other substantive improvement is in the Clean Heat Equity Advisory Group. As it currently stands, S5 explicitly calls for representatives of certain entities like utilities and including the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association, but it's more vague what other members can be. One example is it lists together renters and rental property owners. This doesn't do enough to ensure that Vermonters most affected by the bill are at the table and doesn't ensure that renters will be represented. Thank you for your time, and I'm available for any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I do have, yeah, quick question. So if we were, I can see that there's quite a difference between talking about renters and rental property owners, landlords and tenants, really. Is there a group that you would recommend in terms of bringing forward the interests of tenants?
I mean, there are several tenant unions in the state. We also have a housing justice organizer at Rights and Democracy that's been working with tenants in 6 or 7 different communities in the state. Happy to get you other ideas of folks that represent renters. And I think the big thing about renters is in most cases, renters are the ones paying the energy bills. But they don't have a say in weatherization, mitigation, and all of that. And so they have to pay for the lack of action of their landlords.
Yeah, it is that, I'm hopeful, we're all hopeful that the work that led to RAC passing out bill on the meter tariff will help crack that. It's not finally, but it's been a hard one where we have split incentives. Okay, any? No.
What was the cradle to grave? Was that?
Oh, that's
was it
the
reference to persons? Was it reference?
that was reference
Life-
life cycle emissions, looking at life cycle emissions from cradle to grave. So looking at it for the whole lifespan and making sure that we're taking an accurate accounting of each type of fuel or heat.
So we've had we've listened to criticism of biofuels as perhaps taking more fossil fuels to make than they replace. Is that what you're?
I'm just saying that we need to have an accurate accounting, and I like that in the bill that we need to have a Vermont specific. It's GREET, but it's Vermont specific GREET, and ensuring that we're looking at the whole way. So nothing should be a zero when you're doing the accounting, because everything takes something, whether it's whether it's transportation of materials, whether it's making a heat pump, the actual creation of the heat pump. All of these things actually take carbon, some sort of fuel to do, and so they all should have a score. And ensuring that the mitigations effort have a score that's going to be very low, and that any biofuels that are in the system actually have a score as well that includes every piece of it, not just when it hits Vermont's borders, but every part of its life.
I'm imagining that that analysis will include, even in the case of heat pumps, that you have to manufacture, you have to ship, you have to install, and you have to buy electricity, which may or may not be 100% renewable.
Yeah, there was concerns with the language last year that there could be fuel sources, not just mitigation, but fuel sources that were a zero or close to a negative score. And I don't think that's a realistic way to look at what would happen in with biofuels and other things. So we want to make sure that's being accurately accounted for, and then we have the 80, 60, 20, going down in intensity, so that way it's actually making sure that we're really transitioning to the best possible fuel sources.
Any other committee questions for Mr. Fink?
Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming in, and glad to hear that you find the bill improved over the last year's version.
Definitely, really appreciate it. Thank you.
I don't know if she's here yet. She wasn't here today. Check. We'll have a copy of it.
Yes, sorry.
Jude's on. Oh, thanks.
Hi, good morning. Are you in that? Morning.
Thank you.
Yes. Could you step out? Thanks, man. Appreciate that.
Good morning. Morning. Nice to see you again.
See you.
Thanks for
I'm
making.
glad I made it here.
Thanks for making the trip up. The weather's been a little dicey lately.
I had a slip and fall yesterday, so thanks to Kane, but
I survived.
Sorry to hear that.
It's
Yeah,
a pretty drive.
it's a absolutely beautiful thing. But it actually is very nice to be able to testify remotely.
Just a moment.
Senator White, nice to meet you.
You look like you're.
I remember when you chaired this committee.
Okay, so good morning, and if you could just introduce yourself for the record, and then the floor is yours.
My name is Annette Smith. I live in Danby. Thank you to the chair and the committee for hearing my testimony today. And I'm going old school. I'm reading my testimony, no PowerPoint. I'm executive director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, a grassroots organization founded in 1999 in response to a natural gas power plant and pipeline project proposed for Bennington and Rutland counties. We have worked on issues surrounding mining, landfills, groundwater, stormwater, drinking water, wastewater, solid waste, large farms, pesticides, PFAS, plastics contamination, cell towers, the environmental and societal impacts of energy projects and land use. VC assists people in having a voice in what goes on in their communities, in participating in regulatory processes, and we help protect citizens and towns from excesses of development and the illusion of progress. This is my 23rd year of testifying in Vermont's legislature.
Sometimes we call it a citizens legislature, and it works because citizens come in and help us do our work. So thanks for hanging in there and doing that year after year.
It's really quite surprising to me. My first testimony was House Commerce. Our workload is off the charts. There are so many topics that are important for this committee to address. Vermont's energy policies need updating. I wrote a white paper on Vermont's energy policies, and I've submitted these things for you. In 2018, nothing's really changed. We need to establish protections for forests and farmlands and guide the development to the built landscape. And I've provided you with some maps of just some recent things that have come across my desk. The latest one is a 20 megawatt project in Shaftesbury covering prime ag soil and proposing to cut 30 acres of forest. We're naked for these. There's another one of these, it's a Connecticut commodities company. They want to do something in Fairhaven and Windsor too. And I don't know where in Windsor. We don't find out till they start the process. So I've given you these maps and I encourage you to look at them because, as I call it, it's death by 1,000 cuts. We are dealing with a biodiversity crisis, and that's where Vermont really could be a leader in protecting nature. And I'm just putting out fires, and none of the other environmental organizations engage. The NRC, DPERG, CLF, which is renewable energy, prime ag soils, forests, they're fair game. Nobody else is doing what I'm doing, and I can't keep doing this. We have got to do something because I'm just getting new calls all the time, and it's unbelievable.
The project in Shaftesbury, have they already formally applied for CDG?
They submitted their advance notice 5 days before Christmas.
Okay,
Really rude. And so it's in the district of the chair of the House Ag Committee. I've been saying when Senator Campion was on this committee, and I said one of the projects here has been in Bennington since 2013. I've been saying for years, we've got to do something to establish some policies for protecting forests and fields. And the whole state is just sitting ducks, and you don't find out even where the projects are. The public utility process for siting energy projects needs to be evaluated to determine if there are better options for land use siting the energy projects. And I've given you a one-page description of the process. Act 174's enhanced energy planning is not working as intended to give towns a voice. That was passed in 2016. So it's been 7 years. You haven't done a check back on it. The developer-driven process for siting energy projects is not working to the benefit of Vermonters, and I've given you an evaluation of that, one page, preferred type now, Calibri, 14 point, easy to read. We need a new strategic approach to energy development. I've given you this 10-page PowerPoint. I think I did this in 2018. Like the energy white paper, there's been no audience for it. It's just, we need to talk about it. So I submitted these documents, half a dozen documents. In addition, this legislature needs to hold accountability hearings on the Climate Council to assess how it is functioning. As a creation of the Global Warming Solutions Act with its unachievable emissions reduction mandate. And I've submitted my evaluation for you. And I want you to look at this map and the yellow push pins. Now there are going to be some changes, but okay, Chris Campany down here was just replaced by David Dean. The fuel dealer seat is still open. Where are the rural areas? There's no representation. It's all what I've heard Chris Campany talk about, the I-89 Burlington to Montpelier bubble. And that makes sense for the administration appointees, but rural Vermont is not represented out here. And there are other issues that I've given you my report. I am probably among the top 3, if not the top citizen who has logged the most hours for watching and trying to participate as a citizen in the Climate Council meetings, the steering committee, the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, the ag and ecosystem subcommittee, and the full council. And you need to check back, just like this Act 174. But instead of talking about any of those pressing needs as they affect Vermonters in the real world, I am here today to offer testimony on S5. What would more appropriately be named the stupid heat standard? Since the legislature wants to play games with the names, that is what I'm calling it, because it is a solution in search of a problem and is a bad idea that is not needed. Since it was first proposed 2 years ago, the state has dedicated $250 million for climate initiatives. On top of that, the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, with many more millions of dollars available to Vermonters. The stupid heat standard is intended to create incentives for installers to sell technologies to people to switch away from fossil fuels for heating. Those incentives already exist in the form of high fossil fuel prices without targeting one business sector. When this committee considered the clean heat standard last year, none of those state and federal funds and high fossil fuel prices were a factor. Now I ask you to please justify why the stupid heat standard is necessary, especially when it is distracting this important committee from the very necessary energy policy work and implementation discussions we should be having that have not happened in recent years in the legislature. And I say this name with all due respect. I'm not trying to denigrate any of you, but I do want to make it clear that I think I'm speaking for a lot of people who are not happy with what this proposal has the potential to do to Vermonters. Adoption of the stupid heat standard means increasing electricity consumption from renewable energy, and with the desire for more in-state renewables, the topics I mentioned previously, such as the state's energy policies and siting issues, should come first. Where is the renewable electricity going to come from to fuel all this new consumption? And if it is to be cited in Vermont, is the current developer-driven and developer-biased process the most equitable, just, and environmentally sound method to achieve this transition? Specific objections to the stupid heat standard. Pushing more work onto a PUC that is already doing more than any other PUC in the country. All other states citing telecommunications and energy projects, except for very large projects, is done through local zoning. Vermont's PUC is already overloaded and doing too much. And I've spent the last decade, that's where I've been doing my work, is at the PUC. I know the process so well that lawyers come to me to ask for advice on what to do. And I'm not a lawyer, but this is a process that, if you read my write-up on it, is completely foreign to the average Vermonter. And now you want to throw more work at it. The same PUC that Rich Howard dealt with when he was chair of the Public Service Board. It's a completely different animal, and none of the groups lobbying for this bill ever participate at the PUC. The Stupid Heat Standard proposes to create a convoluted credit system whose primary beneficiaries will be Green Mountain Power, Vermont Gas Systems, and those installers who are already doing what the Stupid Heat Standard would require. Claims that emissions reductions will result from the installation of heat pumps are based on modeling, but have not been supported by actual data. Last year, a Vermont citizen, Kai McKell-Forley, reached out to numerous energy entities to gather data. His research found 2 surveys, and I provided you the links. You can read the results of the surveys from 2017 and 2021, which indicate people love heat pumps for air conditioning. That means more consumption, but winter usage can result in high electric bills that you don't see coming. You should require BGS to provide data on the fossil fuel consumption reduction they have seen as a result of their electric heat pump and water heater installations to date. That's one regulated utility that has data. Let's see what the data is. How much is it resulting in reductions in fossil fuel consumption? And require Green Mountain Power to provide data on how much electricity consumption and consumer costs have increased as a result of electric heat pump and water heater installations to date. This is just basic data I'm suggesting that you get. S5 will have the end result of requiring Vermonters to buy more stuff. Expensive stuff. Heat pumps apparently cost about $20,000. It is insulting to the intelligence of typically frugal Vermonters. It is parental, dictating to people what they have to do rather than respecting the intelligence of Vermonters who are already choosing the recommended tools of heat pumps, wood pellet stoves, and biofuels without the creation of a convoluted credit system. We surveyed our membership, and most of the people who have heat pumps speak very highly of them. We don't need to force this technology, especially with all of the subsidies that are already in place. As we have just seen with 2 recent major winter power outages, the electrification of everything is a formula for people freezing in the dark. Non-electric propane furnaces, wood stoves, and fossil fuel generators are what kept people going. Almost all of the systems S5 requires to create a credit require electricity. Many Vermonters rely on propane, for which there is no alternative. Therefore, S5 promotes inequity and is discriminatory. It is not equitable to force people who have no alternatives to use technologies that are not viable. For instance, I have lived off-grid with solar panels, batteries, and a backup generator for more than 30 years. I have no alternative to propane. I wish I could get off it. But I rely on it for instant hot water heating when the solar hot water system doesn't produce, which has been the case for the last more than a week. I would be boiling water on the wood stove if it were not for propane. And for appliances that, if electric, would use too much electricity, especially at night. I have propane refrigerators. I'd love to get an electric refrigerator. When I went out shopping for them, they cost twice as much as my electric freezer and use twice as much electricity. I mean, we need a lot of low watt appliances that don't exist. I can't use a heat pump, a pellet stove, or a biofuel furnace. They would drain the batteries at night. An insurance company required me to get a non-electric propane heater to get fire insurance. So my request is to please remove propane from S5. The bill enables Vermont Gas Systems, or now called VGS, owned by Energy of Canada, to play in the renewable natural gas credit markets that are developing in the thermal and transportation sectors, giving VGS the ability to buy and sell credits by purchasing landfill gas from out of state, with no actual benefit to Vermonters. S5 says as long as there is a contractual physical pathway for RNG, it can be used in the credit schemes. Okay, so a few molecules of RNG may make it into Vermont's pipeline through the 1,000-mile route from the landfill, maybe. The Department of Public Service testified to the PUC that the Seneca Meadows RNG contract is one of the most expensive means for VGS to reduce emissions. And I'm involved with the people who are opposing that contract at the PUC. I've been supporting and facilitating that participation at the Public Utility Commission. This is not about greening up anything except VGS's public relations spin. In-state landfill and farm gas that can be generated and used in Vermont is fine to claim as RNG, just as landfill gas used close to its source is a reasonable policy. The Seneca Meadows New York landfill gas contract VGS has been pursuing through the PUC process is a good example of gas that can and should be consumed locally, right there in New York. By allowing BGS to claim out-of-state RNG as a benefit to Vermonters, the stupid heat standard assures the continuation of pipeline infrastructure and methane leakage all the way to 2050. At the end of November, the Massachusetts Commission on Clean Heat, a 22-member body appointed by the governor, issued its final report. It makes not a single reference to RNG. It does recommend this: avoid future investments in and strategically retire gas infrastructure to reduce total costs. Just last month, the New York Climate Action Council adopted a plan for adopting the state's emissions reduction law. It acknowledges the severe limitations of RNG. Council member and Cornell professor Robert Howarth, who I hope you will hear from, has explained that the plan does not endorse any widespread use of RNG. In fact, the plan specifies that it is generally preferable to use biogas directly and at the site of production, rather than refining the biogas to produce RNG. This out-of-state credit system is just another gimmick. People are already upset that the renewable energy credits for all of Vermont's wind projects and most of Vermont's large solar projects are sold out of state. Nobody can point to a Vermont wind turbine and say, that is renewable energy for Vermonters. Rather than reining in that credit system, this stupid heat standard enables another, even more convoluted new system. Please allow only in-state produced RNG. S5 requires the use of more biofuels, which entail enormous land conversion and factory farm issues. I recommend you hear from Rachel Smolper, who's a leading expert on biofuels globally. Vermont's fuel dealers are already using more biofuels in their fuel oil mix. They don't need to be forced to do it. Vermont has real issues related to energy that should be a priority. This stupid heat standard fails to address those issues and is nothing but a distraction. It is dangerous as it places nearly all of our energy eggs into one basket, electricity. It is poor public policy that places Vermonters, especially low-income Vermonters, at risk. It is a bad idea, plain and simple. That said, it is evident that the skids are greased for this bill to pass, and it will be enacted into law. I could have submitted a lot of credible information about the failure of credit markets to reduce emissions, but didn't want to waste my time since this bill is a done deal. Legislators will get to claim they did something about climate change. Leadership will boast that Vermont is first in the nation. Proponents will get to make money selling it to other states. Vermonters will be paying the price of this stupid and corrupt policy, which is really all about money. Now to questions. To whom do low and moderate income fuel dealers disclose their income? I'm moderate income. If I want to use credit for something. If a heat pump installer sells a credit to a fuel dealer, how many times will that information get transferred? Who keeps the database? How secure is it? What real-world Vermont data exists to show that installing an electric heat pump reduces fossil fuel emissions? Does the data support the modeling? What kinds of high electric bill shocks are happening to people with heat pumps during the coldest months? Heat pumps cost a lot of money, and the subsidies pay only a portion. Are people living paycheck to paycheck supposed to take out loans and incur debt to enable an installer or fuel dealer to earn credit? Will a fuel subsidy program for electric heat customers be created similar to LIHEAP, as Vermont's electricity customers will be using more electricity for heating, cooling, hot water, and vehicle charging? What options are available for customers who use propane? In addition to a gasoline generator, I also have a propane generator. How will the stupid heat standard allow for my different usage of propane for heating versus electricity generation for battery charging and running heavy machinery? What is the plan for small propane companies whose businesses will be forced out under this bill? Will there be job training or any assistance for the owners of the family fuel delivery companies whose shutdown will be a consequence of this bill? For those who stay in business, will there be transition funding to assist these companies with the costs of doing so? Where are all the electricians, plumbers, and contractors who are to be hired to do weatherization and new technology installations? Once this is in place, why can't I just drive over to New Hampshire and get my propane cylinders filled there? An unelected climate council has made a recommendation that is being pushed to an unelected PUC to develop. How is the legislature going to hold the climate council and the PUC accountable for the decisions they are making? The Climate Council has a science and data subcommittee and a just transition subcommittee. Why is it necessary for the C, to create 2 new subcommittees whose charge mirrors the subcommittees already in place at the Climate Council. Why is the PUC charged with hiring a consultant to do a life cycle emissions analysis when ANR has contracted to do the same thing? Will CO2 emissions from burning wood be accurately accounted for rather than excluded as biogenic? ANR's life cycle emissions analysis contractor said that they will use Vermont's in-state greenhouse gas emissions inventory to quantify the impacts from biomass within the state boundary. The contractor indicates in a July 9, 2022 email that someone sent me that they got the public records request that ANR does not expect the contractor to include biogenic CO2. For combustion of biomass, that is stationary combustion of wood, there will be greenhouse gas emissions from methane and nitrous oxide that will be included. The contractor offers an option to track biogenic carbon dioxide from combustion. Now, this has been a big topic that is unresolved at the Climate Council. It did not accept the recommendations of the biomass or of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee on Biomass. And so they created a biomass task group. And I've attended every meeting, and they are struggling with trying to come up with recommendations. But through that, we got the actual data that CO2 emissions at McNeil are 503,000 metric tons. And then if you add in Rygate, the 2 plants produce the equivalent of CO2 emissions of about 145,000 automobiles, or about 2/3 of all the registered automobiles in Vermont. But we don't count it. And the ANR life cycle analysis is not going to count it. So explicitly require of ANR and the PUC an honest accounting of biogenic CO2 emissions. The idea that, oh, the trees will grow back in 100 years, the CO2 is going up in the atmosphere now. That's the thing that should be assessed, not playing games with it. Threat of litigation if Vermont fails to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act, which you all as a body enabled. The Global Warming Solution Act emissions reduction mandates is being held out as the imperative to pass the superheat standard. This threat is overblown. How many times has Thomas Malone of Alco Renewable Energy sued state government? Well, the PUC has been sued twice in federal court, along with the governor and other state agencies, and ANR has also been sued in Superior Court. The Attorney General's office defends the suits. It's not the end of the world. Most likely result of a lawsuit will be a countersuit challenging the constitutionality of the Global Warming Solutions Act. The threat of litigation should not be a driving force in the legislature's actions to address climate change. Many times during the Climate Council meetings, Chris Campany, who I am sorry is leaving the council because he was by far, he and Catherine Dimitri, who are both leading and both executive directors of regional planning commissions, were by far the most balanced people with the best input. And Chris numerous times suggested that the Climate Council come back to the legislature and ask the Global Warming Solutions Act to be changed so the mandate is not just about emissions reductions, but it's about resilience and biodiversity. And because, as I described in my report on the Climate Council, it's a dysfunctional body that has no real decision-making process. It just dies. Any idea just sort of dies unless it's being pushed by someone with an agenda. And so it's been very, I will say, discouraging and disheartening to witness the Climate Council's work because of the way the legislature set it up, where the Secretary of Administration was named the chair, and no fault to the Secretary of Administration, but there's no dynamic for actually making decisions. And one example of that is at their last meeting where they had an action item to vote to accept the report to the legislature because there was some public comment and everybody needed to leave and go off. They never voted on it. The report got accepted, but it was never voted on. And that's the sort of thing that I've been witnessing it so many times. Those of us who do participate and attend in public comment had, it's like going into a black hole. There was never any discussion. I've made suggestions on transportation. Why don't we look at getting people out of their cars and commuter rail on the Western Rail Corridor? Nobody ever talks about it. Solar or hot water, don't talk about it. Just because, so they actually finally, I think at the facilitators' recommendation, added in that when people make public comment, that there will be time for the council members to respond. And the last time that I made a comment, which was, will the council do sort of a look in the mirror and provide as part of your report, how's it going? Do a self-evaluation. It's a common thing to do in organizations. It's been 2 years. How about a look back? How are we doing? And I made that comment, and then it came back, well, anybody have any comments? Dead. So Councilmember Leslie Ann Tweed, I forget her last name, she actually spoke up and said, what about Annette's comment? And so that generated a bit of a discussion. But people thought it was a good idea, but then they also said they don't have the capacity to do it. Why doesn't the council have the capacity to do it? And that's because of the way the legislature set it up. And I think these committees that you're telling the PUC to set up will have the same dysfunction the way the bill is written, because there's nobody in charge. The facilitators are running the meeting. I'm saying this because nobody else really is in the position to say it. I had to log so many hours, and I feel a responsibility to at least tell you what's going on. And you need to actually look at what you've done and do a check back. So I thank you very much for hearing my testimony, and I'd be glad to answer questions.
So clearly you don't like this plan. What would be your plan? And given that we need to get off fossil fuels, we have, as you've identified, a shortage of workers, and a significant amount of money needs to go towards helping people get off of fossil fuels. So what would be your plan?
So I'm a realist. I'm a pragmatic person. And my experience living the way I have lived for more than 30 years, I view as a little microcosm of the transition that we need to make. So right now, people are using the grid when they have heat pumps as their storage at night. That's what's running their heat pumps. Whatever the source of electricity is. And the Department of Public Service is about to hold some forums on where does our electricity come from? Great starting place. When you have a system, and I like to think in terms of a system, you have got to think of the big grid that we have right now. What's their version of a generator? It's gas plants, and on December 24th, it was oil plants. How do we stop using fossil fuels? Right now, with the technologies we have, we don't. It's not realistic. Anybody who thinks we can do it all with wind, solar, and batteries is deluding themselves. And I do not want to find myself in the position of being a proponent and a pusher of fossil fuels. Remember, I got my start stopping a 1,080 megawatt gas plant in Rutland and a 270 megawatt gas plant in Bennington, which were strongly supported by Howard Dean. And my first testimony in here was learning that the bill had been introduced to waive Section 248 B2, the need clause, so that those plants could happen. And then I found out that the Dean administration sought a waiver of the NOx offset provision of the Clean Air Act to enable those gas plants. And if I hadn't crawled out of the woods and given up my life, that I had planned to be a farmer and biodynamic farming and completely different track, we would have those gas plants and over 100 miles, 24-inch high-pressure pipeline in southwestern Vermont. So don't make me into, I've been called an anti-renewable zealot. I've been called, anti-renewable. That's outrageous. I'm offended by that. You may be offended by me calling this a stupid heat standard.
Yes.
But I am very offended by my work in Vermont's communities to help people at least have a say in what goes on in their communities. When we get involved in a handful of renewable energy projects, thousands and thousands and thousands of them go through without any involvement of us. But there are some really bad developments proposed, as we know with Act 250 too. So what is my solution? As I said, we have topics that we need to talk about. We need to completely fix where our process for how we are going to fuel this electrification that everybody wants to do. And by putting this first and charging an overburdened PUC, which may come in tomorrow and say, oh, yes, we can do this, it's what we do. But I'm watching this on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, I'm not criticizing the PUC. There are renewable energy advocates that are slamming the PUC at every opportunity. I'm not doing that. I am respecting what they do and saying they're already doing more. I got 4 tower cases right now. Those are, the process is brutal. And so what we're doing and how we're doing it needs to be looked at as a whole system, and not just a concept that creates a credit system that doesn't, it's just so complicated, you know, can you explain it?
Yes, I can.
So, I want to have a different conversation. And we also need to talk about using less. And nobody's talking about that.
I disagree with that.
It's not a topic of the climate council.
In other words, thank you.
Senator White and Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. What renewable energy projects have you supported as an organization?
That's not the nature of what we do. We're not an advocacy organization that comes in here and lobbies for policies that are supporting things. We are a reactive organization. We respond to the issues that Vermonters bring to us. So, I mean, I was on Vermont Edition about 2016, and I asked that I point to well-cited renewable energy projects.
Yeah.
Today, I drove through Rutland. I passed lots and lots of solar panels, all covered with snow. Now, my solar panels are not covered with snow because I need the generation. And so I clean my solar panels off, but I passed tons of them. The Green Mountain Power Project at the Rutland High School on the landfill, fine. The thing I really like that I want to see more of, and again, we didn't support it because it wasn't something that needed anybody to come in and say, rah, rah. But the parking lot at the Stafford Technical Center at the Rutland High School, why aren't we doing more of that? It's amazing. And in the summer you go by and all the cars are in the shade. It's got room for electric vehicle chargers. There aren't any there. Right across the street, there are some Tesla chargers. Why aren't we doing more parking lots? So that was a topic at the Net Meter Removal Workshop. And PUC Chair Roisman made a really important comment. And that was because the developers were in there saying, we want more money for the net meter. And he said, well, you know, we know the profits and the costs of the regulated utilities. We don't know anything about your profits and costs. And this was partly in the context of what does it cost to do a parking lot? Because they all say, well, it costs more. So they were invited to please give us your information. And that's why in my my strategic planning for, this is what I'm for. Take a look at it. This has in it, regulate the merchant developers. So we know what their profits are, so that they're fair to ratepayers. Because right now we have a very unbalanced system where the utilities, salaries, and rate of return are all regulated. The merchant developers, who knows how much they're making? And so the inequities that are built into the system we have now, with developers driving things, and with the cost of everything going up, are you know, creating real challenges for Vermonters who can't even figure out how to, you know, pay their heating bill.
Thank you.
I'm mindful of time. Last question to you, Senator McCormick.
I want to talk substantively. Before I do, I just want to make a remark to you as an on-again, off-again ally over many years, and as a friend. And that is, I don't know what your motives were in that, but words mean things. And your words about the bill being a done deal impugns the intentions and the motives of this committee.
Yes.
And as a member of the committee, first of all, because it comes from a friend, I'm hurt, insulted, but it's also just not appropriate. I have often suspected the motives of a colleague. I have never challenged a colleague's motives publicly. There are people I do not respect, but I treat them with respect. I treat them respectfully because that's the process we're in. And I just, yeah, I've said that I wanted to add that. But now I would like to go back to Senator Watson's question, because I think you made some very valid points, but I'm not sure you actually answered her question, which is, if we don't go the way that this bill proposes, what do we do instead? And it just, I mean, so just policy points, I tend to wrangle myself, because it's a function of intelligence. This reminds you of that, this is connected to that. Try to just focus on what legislative proposals you would make.
I understand that you want something to say we're doing something.
No,
Policy.
no, I don't, and I don't think the rest of the
Okay.
committee does.
So,
I want to address the overarching issue of our time, which is global warming,
and
particular
so
energy consumption.
I guess I would come back and say, why hasn't $250 million that are now dedicated, why hasn't all the money that's coming down through these federal programs, why isn't that, which weren't a factor last year, why isn't that enough? Because we need to we need to build the workforce. I feel like people are already making the choices that you want this bill to make, but this is going to put it off through this complicated PUC process, and they're going to come back with something, and it's going to be a couple of years from now. Meanwhile, why don't we get going and actually use the money that has been dedicated to do this? That's why I say, and I mean this respectfully to all of you, but I want to comment on why I said what I did, which is because this legislative session opened with what was being then called the Clean Heat Standard as we're going to get this through. It failed by only one vote last year. And when I say I'm speaking for a lot of people, that's the impression that a lot of people have. And I honestly mean no disrespect to this committee. I believe that you are going to, and have already started holding thoughtful and informed testimony on it. But I don't know that I've ever seen in all my years a bill that has so much head steam to move forward. And I felt like I needed to say it, and I'm sorry that if you felt disrespected.
It's not a matter of how I felt. I'm not talking about my feelings. I did mention my feelings, that I was hurt, but that's not the main point. I'm talking about the appropriateness of what you said.
Look, I'm not happy that I had to come in here and rename something that you all renamed. I'm very uncomfortable having to do this, but it's a position that I have found myself in because I feel somebody has to say it and nobody else is going to. All right, what solutions do you want to work on? We are focusing on a transition to renewable energy. You're trying to reduce the fossil fuel consumption and replace it with electricity. Where that electricity comes from, a lot of Vermonters want it to come from in-state. That's where I'm trying to move the focus, to say, we're not doing that. The 20 megawatt Shaftesbury project, it's going to go into Belco's 345 kV line. They're not even talking to Green Mountain Power. They're going to sell it into the big grid. How many more of these projects do you want to see happen that aren't advancing Vermont's energy goals at all? They're not providing renewable energy for Vermont. Oh, it's for the region. And talk to Belco about how they like these projects. So I'm seeing a disconnect. I'm trying to make the connection that you can't fuel this transition just by saying no to fossil fuels. You have to have something to fuel with. And I'm waiting for that magic breakthrough that gets me off of that generator. Because right now, that's what I gotta do, is run a gasoline generator, and if I had an electric vehicle, I'd have to run the gasoline generator to charge my electric vehicle. That's reality. And just the idea that you can charge it off the grid, okay, then it's Hydro-Quebec, it's Seabrook Nuclear, it's oil plants, it's gas plants. We need to look at the whole system and what we're doing in Vermont, and we can't just say, no, you can't use propane when we don't have anything that can be used as an alternative?
I don't think the bill says you can't use propane.
My
Yeah,
propane
that's-
dealer is a really small business and they're fairly certain that they're not going to survive. If this goes into place, they expect they'll go out of business. And I know that there are other propane dealers in Rutland County who feel the same way. I'm going to be stuck with Suburban Propane, which is notorious for, well, their business practices. That's, that's why I'm asking. What's the plan for the small family fuel dealers that feel very threatened by this? I don't think that's an unreasonable question to ask.
Okay, so thank you. I'll provide one answer, and the bill actually, there are numerous fuel dealers who see in this bill a transition path to a more diverse set of services they can deliver. No one buys any particular fuel for any reason other than to stay warm. I don't think there's an attachment to the fuel type in and of itself. So becoming a service provider for warmth as opposed to just a vendor for particular fuel is something we've heard from fuel dealers that are looking forward, are saying this is a pathway.
Right, and as I said in my testimony, this will benefit the people who are able to do that. From my experience, the alternatives that are allowed in this bill, or that are called for in this bill, when I'm supposed to get a biofuel oil burner, and those use electricity. I don't know what non-electric heat sources there are. And I can't do it all with wood because I can't get fire insurance. So that's, I think you ought to hear from the fuel dealers who say this isn't going to work. Because I know there are plenty of people who think this will work and they'll actually make a lot of money off of it. Hear from the ones who say, wait a minute, remember last year there was some man here sitting in the seats here, a fuel dealer from the Mad River Valley who asked to be heard. And he wasn't on the agenda, but he took his testimony. You need to hear from a lot of those types of people because this is a major change that's proposed for a very important sector of Vermont's communities.
So I'm gonna call it quits, other than to say, we will hear from more fuel dealers, not just from Mr. Coda. And I think what we have in part ahead of us is a task of communicating accurately what the program will offer for a pathway to fuel dealers, as well as the implications of selling fossil fuels, which are not disallowed by the bill. They just are assessed based on their carbon intensity. And that goes all the way back to, and then I'm going to stop, but the last word is going to be mine this one. The North Star is reducing greenhouse gases because the physics of the problem we're facing are that if we don't reduce greenhouse gases, we drive fires. Or we could talk about what's Vermont's role, all that kind of stuff. But at this point, we're clear, both in law and I'd say we have a moral obligation to address that problem.
And I'd suggest there's a direct path. The credit system
And
is
Senator
not
Bray
direct.
was gonna have to last word.
No, I think Jared's going to have the last word.
Okay, so thank you again for coming in.
Thank you for hearing. I appreciate it very much.
The materials that you were referencing, if you sent them on to Jude, so.
Jude has them.
Posted.
Okay,
I don't know if anybody wants any of the hard copies.
I think, well, we all
Electronic.
can pull things off our own website.
No, she has
We're
them.
trying to be more paperless than we used to be. Okay, so thank you for coming in. Thanks for those resources and we'll follow up.
Thank you.
So we are running a little behind, but I would, since we have a relatively short day today, I would just ask, anybody, we don't have a late schedule. I'd say, let's just go on through Mr. Duval, and then we'll have some time for committee discussion, and I think we'll have a prior to noon. So good morning, Mr. Duval. Thanks for coming back. Probably you need to remind us which hat you're wearing today. And I don't know if you had some testimony, I think you've also heard. You've been listening to the testimony we heard this morning, so you're free to comment on, to bring your testimony or reply to anything you've heard. Whatever you think is most useful for the committee to learn.
Thank you, Chair Bray, Vice Chair Watson, Senator McDonald, Senator McCormick, and Senator White. Glad to be with you again this morning. For the record, my name is Jared Duval, and testifying this morning in my capacity as an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council, appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees to provide expertise to the council with regard to energy data and analysis. So as testimony has unfolded over the last couple of weeks on this bill, a lot of questions have arisen and kind of points of information have arisen. And I would like to help try to answer some questions and clarify things as requested by the chair. This is an incredibly important bill, and it's important that our deliberation about it is based on accurate information and not misinformation. And it's important that when questions come up about it, they get direct and clear responses. Most of what I want to respond to is honest, fair questions. And I want to be clear about that. There are some other parts that came up that I do not think are an accurate representation of the facts or information. I'll address those later. To start, I would like to make two high-level points. I've been hearing language that does not have it's very confusing to me where it is coming from. And it is, we just heard it from the last witness, this notion that the greenhouse gas emissions reduction obligations that are established in law are not achievable. I want to be very clear. The Energy Action Network has done in-depth analysis, modeling about the scale and pace of change in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of moving beyond fossil fuels to proven and available technologies that save people money. The Climate Council then commissioned its own independent research done through Cadmus, the Energy Futures Group, and SEI. And what both sets of modeling found is that the obligations in the Global Warming Solutions Act for emissions reduction are achievable. Now, it is also true in the recent report to the Vermont Climate Council and in Energy Action Network's reporting that we are not currently on track to meet those requirements. But not on track does not mean not achievable. It means that doing nothing, continuing business as usual, is not going to get there, that we need additional policy. And that is what the Climate Action Plan recommended, the policies that can get us to meeting those obligations while saving Vermonters money and strengthening the Vermont economy. So I want to be very clear. The modeling shows that the targets are achievable, that we have the proven and available technologies and best practices and programs, but we need market shifting policy to get off of a business as usual track that is advantaging, externalizing the costs of fossil fuel pollution and advantaging the fossil fuel status quo rather than the options that are cleaner and can save folks money. The other thing I'd like to note is that I've heard from a number of witnesses and commentators about what the Affordable Heat Act and the Clean Heat Standard that it would establish require of Vermonters, and this language around forcing. To be clear, the obligated parties in the bill are the importers of fossil fuels into Vermont. Individual Vermonters, residents, businesses are not required to do anything. They are not forced to do anything. Of course, this bill will help create the incentives that make it more attractive for people to move to cleaner heating options, to invest in energy efficiency so that they can save money over time. But this notion that this bill requires or forces anybody to do anything is just plain wrong. Indeed, it was crafted to be a market-friendly, flexible policy that would allow us to achieve our obligations with cost-effectively and equitably. There were some questions that came up in Mr. Coda's testimony last week that I also want to respond to. I'm going to paraphrase here. I hope I get him. I hope I do so as accurately as he would hope for. But there was a.
Sorry, to interrupt. If we're going on Mr. Curtis' testimony, just a quick question. So on the confusing language about it being unachievable, and I don't know if you're, it's reminding me of, besides the fact that it's being achievable, modeling also shows anticipated savings. So I don't know if you're going to come back to that, or if you want to tie it in while we're in the neighborhoods.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to address that now. So there have been two sets of economic analysis with regard to the climate action plan. And the first, let me just pull out my report so I reference the correct number. The first report was on the climate action plan as a whole. And what it found was a net savings by 2050 and avoided damages of $6.4 billion. And that's all of the recommendations across all sectors. That includes both energy cost savings from avoided high cost price volatile fossil fuel consumption, also included avoided social, economic, and environmental damages. So including a social cost of carbon, which are very real costs to the people who face the consequences of a destabilized climate in terms of severe weather events and harm to infrastructure and increased health costs because of the spread of diseases, et cetera. Those are real costs, even though they are sometimes, I will leave it there. The other
Pause on that one, because sometimes I think some people end up thinking, well, I'm not in a floodway, so it's not going to happen to me. So why do I would like to be helpful, but in general, but it's not actually my problem. You have a way, I mean, I have my own answer to that, but I don't know if you have something, because that's another way that people push back on the social cost of carbon.
I think it's certainly correct that there are certain people in populations that are more exposed than others, and there are very compelling environmental justice reasons to reduce pollution, both because the folks who are most likely to experience, harm tend to be lower income folks, communities of color around the world and here in Vermont. But those costs also accrue to all of us. When we have to respond as a society with, public investment to respond to a disaster, that is something that we all need to contribute to. So it's not just if somebody is directly in the path of a floodway, or directly gets a Lyme disease or whatever that this affects us all. The other piece of economic analysis that was developed for the Climate Council was a report that just came out this fall called the Marginal Abatement Cost Curves Report. And that looked at all of the measures proposed in the pathways in the Climate Action Plan, and put them on what you've referred to, Senator Bray, as the McKinsey curve. So we can see what's the relative emissions reduction we get from each of those measures, and the net costs or savings per ton of greenhouse gas emissions reduced from those measures. And if you add up all of the thermal measures that would be covered by the Affordable Heat Act in their analysis, there was a net savings to Vermonters projected of $2 billion. And that's just direct energy savings costs by as a result of the actions taken by 2030. So those savings wouldn't all happen between now and 2030, because if somebody does a weatherization project in 2025, they're going to have savings that happen, out beyond 2030. But the total amount of activity that is expected to occur to meet the emissions reduction obligations is expected to save folks, Vermonters, $2 billion as a result of all those actions by 2030. I will note here that if you also then add in the social cost of carbon, which is again a very real cost, those savings go to $5 billion. So To me, I think it's really important that when we talk about affordability and cost, we recognize the unaffordability and the high cost of the current system. And I feel as though anybody who talks about affordability or cost without a policy proposal for how to get off of the thing that is costing us the most, which is the high cost and price volatile fossil fuels, to me it rings hollow. Unless we have a policy mechanism to help Vermonters shift off of that, to get off of that dependence, it's not a real strategy. And that's exactly what this bill is that strategy, to not leave that $2 billion or that $5 billion in savings kind of on the sidelines, to actually allow Vermonters to benefit from it.
That reminds me of Senator McCormick's reminder to all of us that not acting is a choice, is a
No plan is a
plan.
plan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Mr.
I'm listening.
So there was a very fair question from Mr. Cota last week that I wanted to address, and my recollection is that he had said, well, it could be very complex and confusing to know which uses of fuels are obligated under the clean heat standard, because a fuel oil or a fossil gas or propane could be used for space heating, or it could be used for something else. I believe this answer is already clearly in the bill, in the definitions of the bill. I just want to share that with the committee. In the definitions section, which is page 6, lines 3 through 5, or if it's easier to follow, subsection 8123, definition 11, the thermal sector is defined. It says the thermal sector has the same meaning as the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector as used in the Vermont Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Forecast. So again, the Affordable Heat Act ties directly back to the Global Warming Solutions Act obligations, which is directly tied to Vermont's Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So what that means is it doesn't matter if pipeline gas is used for water heating or for a stove, or if fuel oil is used for space heating or for a generator. As fuels captured in the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector, all fossil-based thermal fuels, including oil, propane, fossil gas, coal, and kerosene, are covered regardless of their exact end use. And I trust that Senator Watson could speak to this as a physics teacher. You know, whether you're using it for space heating or water heating, it's a combustion activity that is generating heat, the fuel and energy process. So they all are thermal fuels that are covered. I will note here that transportation fuels, which of course have an internal combustion process, are categorized differently in the inventory, and under this bill would not be covered, like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. But all residential, commercial, and industrial fuels in the emissions inventory that everything ties back to for Vermont are, those are the residential or thermal fuels, the residential, commercial, and industrial fuels.
Any questions on that one?
The next question that came up from Mr. Cota, which I think was another good question, was about the default delivery agent. I want to refer the committee to page 11, lines 12 through 16, or subsection 8124 F2. I'll read it for folks who aren't able to quickly get there. It says the commission shall designate the default delivery agent. The default delivery agent shall be a single statewide entity capable of providing a variety of clean heat measures and contracted for a multi-year period through a competitive procurement process. The entity selected as the default delivery agent may also be a market participant, but shall not be an obligated party. Now, again, I am not 100% sure, but when I heard Mr. Cota's testimony, it sounded as though he was assuming that a market participant meant a private for-profit business. I read this language different. The market is the market for clean heat credits, and any entity, whether a business, whether a nonprofit, whether a government program that undertakes activities that reduce thermal sector emissions, are going to be eligible for clean heat credits and therefore clean heat market participants. So Mr. Cota brought up the example of, why not have the weatherization assistance program serve as the default delivery agent? I will say my read of this section is that they certainly would be eligible as a market participant. If you're delivering weatherization services to Vermonters, those are projects that will generate clean heat credits, and you're therefore a market participant in the clean heat market, and they would be an eligible provider. I do think that there is wisdom in the bill as written in requiring a careful process through the PUC, including an RFP process, to ensure there's this other part of the default delivery agent language that says an entity capable of providing a variety of clean heat measures. My understanding, and I understand that you are going to have testimony from Sarah Phillips, the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, and perhaps she could speak more to this. But my understanding is that for a long time, the weatherization assistance program was really only able to provide weatherization, sometimes some health and safety measures if there was asbestos or vermiculite. More recently, because of new federal funding streams that are not going to, will likely not last forever, they have been able to do some additional things, like, if they're helping weatherize a home and there's an opportunity to install a heat pump water heater, they have been able to do that. But that's only been relatively recently. And I think ideally that continues, and they are able to provide a variety of measures. But I think the ideal situation would be for low-income Vermonters, moderate-income Vermonters, any Vermonters who are trying to figure out what the best strategy for them is and to reduce their emissions and reduce their costs, to be served by a default delivery agent that can provide them multiple opportunities rather than just one. And so I think, could that be the weatherization assistance program in the Office of Economic Opportunity? It could. The bill allows for that, since they will be a market participant. But I think that it is worth going through the careful process to make sure that whoever is chosen will be able to deliver the kind of full multitude that customers of services that customers may want or need. So I'll leave it there.
So question about the designated delivery agents. Was there discussion with the Climate Council or folks who had input on this, the crafting, around the logic for there being one designated delivery agent or versus multiple, if they meet certain, get certified or meet criteria or something like that?
Yeah, so some of the considerations that went into that was just for sake of clarity. And there was also, because we have the renewable energy standard, there is an example there with a default delivery agent. And so some of it was building on existing kind of practices and programs, and some of it was wanting to ensure clarity. I would say that oftentimes a default delivery agent, could be, it's entirely possible that a default delivery agent could be selected who could then subcontract to provide services that they don't directly do. But that, if there's somebody in a part of the state or a specific technology that they are not doing in-house, but they want to make sure is provided, my reading of this would allow that kind of subcontracting activity to provide even more services.
Yeah, to a point, since we've talked about Efficiency Vermont as a model, you've worked there, so you can speak to it directly. But it seems as though they do a lot of partnering rather than developing the full capacity in-house.
So one follow-up, so just to clarify, I'm now putting something together here. So Efficiency Vermont is the designated delivery agent for the renewable energy standard.
I don't
Or
believe,
BIC. Okay.
my understanding is that for tier 3, I would have to double check, but my understanding is that the Clean Energy Development Fund, which is housed out of the Public Service Department and provides incentives for advanced heating systems, is the receives non-compliance payments from utilities that don't meet their compliance targets. But I would need to double check on some of those, and I believe you'll have Mr. Poor from the Public Service Department, and he could speak more to that as well.
Great, thank you. Well, it's good to know, that it's based on model. So,
Certainly, John.
You just had some. Your pal just said that he had a different interpretation of some language in the bill. Mr. Coda has one interpretation, and Mr. Val has another. Mr. Chair, we're in charge of language.
Yeah.
What is our intention between those two choices?
What is our intention between those two choices?
Well, do we wish our language to bolster Mr. Dakota's interpretation or Mr. Vidal's interpretation?
So I'm flagging things for us to walk through as a council, and so it's a question of, I think your question's a good question. We want to try to eliminate ambiguity and help send a clear set of directions across the street.
We need to set a direction between those two choices.
Yes.
So, have we, what's our pleasure? Or will we get to that sometime soon?
We will, because I don't know how many other, I have a lot of flags on my copy of things to come back to. I know others have been flagging stuff as we went. So it may be later this week, or it might be beginning of next. I think we'll do a strike wall, and we'll do line edits that's how we'll answer the kind of question you're raising as part of doing the strike. But it's a good,
If it can be clearer, it's either, so actually, this is a question. When things go to PUC or to LCAR, do these conversations about the intent sort of travel there?
I'd say less hard conversations in committee, because in a way, once the bill has passed, it's really challenging to characterize accurately what's the intent of the legislature, because it's 180 people.
Yeah.
And however, we have an intent section of the bill just for that reason. So I think in response to your question, I'd say, let's lean into reading that intent section really carefully, rereading it really carefully to make sure it accurately reflects what we're intending.
Or if it can be clarified just in the language, then.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I'd say, I'm guessing it's a unanimous vote for clarity.
No, ours, unanimous vote for intent. We could go to the courts and have them read the language and they'll make it clear what the language says. What do we want it to say?
So, seems like we will thank you for that, and we'll dig into each instance as we keep working our way through. So, McCormick.
It's dismaying to realize how complex the math is on this issue. Because there are several different technologies. And for each of them, there is the question of how much carbon is saved, how much carbon is used, saving carbon in terms of manufacturing, transport, and so on. I don't know does anyone actually have a complete handle on the math? And in particular, what I'm looking at is this. Is it actually possible to provide through alternative green technologies enough energy to make everybody happy that is not contributing, exacerbating global warming? In particular, if our standard is the shift from carbon fuels to non-carbon with the intention of providing as much energy as we presently provide, or likely provide in the future with fossil. In other words, is it possible to have a green way of supporting our contemporary middle-class American lifestyle? Or do we have to focus more than we are on conservation, on actually using it less?
It's a great question, and there's a couple questions in there
Yeah,
that I want to get to. I think the first is, and we heard in the last testimony, why aren't we focusing on energy conservation and efficiency? I think that is a real mischaracterization of the Climate Council's work for a couple of reasons. The pathways that were passed And the recommendations around weatherization at scale was to weatherize an additional 80,000 Vermont homes and buildings by 2030. Weatherization is efficiency and conservation. It's helping people save energy and save money. I think sometimes there's also this characterization that switching to a different technology is not efficiency. I don't have the exact numbers right in front of me. I would be happy to share them. Perhaps Senator Watson can speak to this because I know that she knows a lot of the science behind it. But the benefit of moving from a fuel oil water heater to a heat pump water heater, or from moving to an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, it's not just that you have the opportunity to not use fossil fuels and you can draw on an electricity portfolio that's lower carbon. It's that internal combustion as a process is inherently energy inefficient and energy intensive. And the efficiencies that you get from using electric motors, regardless of where, like, let's just take the example of an electric vehicle, regardless of where the electricity comes from. And in Vermont, our portfolio is 95% fossil free. So we have the lowest emitting portfolio of any state in the country. But even if it was just kind of, fossil fuels or more fossil fuel intensive like it is out in the Midwest, there is a huge energy savings because electric motors and electric vehicles convert energy far more efficiently, so you use less energy overall. So changing to a new technology, it's not about the latest shiny thing. It's about, that is conservation and efficiency in and of itself. And that's also true on a number of thermal sector technologies, including heat pumps. They're just more efficient at turning energy into heat than the internal combustion process, which loses a lot of energy and heat as part of it.
Those are the more efficient ways of producing the energy. But I'm talking about just actually using less energy. I've got two examples. Air drying your laundry instead of using a mechanical dryer.
Yeah.
Okay. Another one is my granddaughter and her boyfriend lived with us for a while. He used to take these long showers, and I'm not such a paranoid crank that I timed him. I never timed him, but okay. But what I
On the record.
what I did to know, but what I did do is I did time myself. Okay, holding back nothing, denying myself nothing. I was in and out of the shower in 4.5 minutes. Okay, get wet, get soapy, get scrubbed, get rinsed, get out. Okay. There is something called a Navy shower, which is a little more disciplined. Get wet, turn the water off, get soapy, get scrubbed, turn the water back on. Okay, that you're done in about 2 minutes. There is no alternative source of energy there. I'm simply using less. Garrison Keillor used to make fun of his father, but I think his father was right when he would say, "If you're cold, wear a sweater." That actually, I think, makes perfect sense. Okay, now, do we need, okay, is it possible to provide for the energy wants of American middle class type people? Because it's not just the American middle class anymore. Everybody in the world seems to want to be as wasteful as we are. Okay, they admire us. Is it possible to support that with green technologies? Or do people have to maybe learn to live like adults? Editorial
Seems like a
comment.
large question
That's a
to
big
lay on
question.
our guest who's here to talk about.
No, but you're familiar with the technology. What?
Yeah, I would, it's a complicated question that involves a lot of assumptions, different studies.
Yeah.
And I'm familiar with a number that look at different states, provinces, countries that have shown the ability to clearly decouple what's happening with their economy from what's happening with their emissions. And so, there is a sense in which we can meet the needs. I'm not gonna, I think wants is a conversation. I would say I think it's really nuanced. I think that there's a lot of our neighbors who are lower income, who have energy, energy burdens and needs where we want to be supporting them in being able to use more energy if it means they can be warmer and get to where they need to go in terms of school or hospital appointments. Is there also a lot of energy waste, especially among the wealthiest, in terms of, conspicuous consumption and, very, second and third homes? Yeah, there is that. But I think that, so I do think it's important to be nuanced when we ask people to conserve. There's some people who are using a lot more and have a lot more ability to conserve. And there are some people who their use of less is not by choice, it can lead to health problems. But overall, I think the vision of, as I read, part of the vision of this bill is to very clearly and squarely meet Vermonters' energy needs, but do it in a way that creates less pollution and saves them money. Now, I think that there's more complexity when we look at it at a national or a global level, but that would be my short answer. I hope it was.
Does the bill as written, and then I'll shut up, does the bill as written pay enough attention to conservation?
I think so in two ways. Anytime that, so there's a lot of energy conservation pieces that are explicitly listed as eligible for clean heat credits. That includes weatherization. It includes, but it also shows up regardless of the clean heat credits, the less, so each year's annual obligation in terms of how much emissions need to be achieved is based on the prior year fuel sales. So if the obligated parties are effective at helping people conserve, helping people invest in efficiency, and it lowers their overall fuel sales, then the percentage reduction they need to achieve will be less than if that consumption was higher. So there is an incentive for the obligated parties to help people use less when it makes sense for them. So I think that it does show up in the bill. And, I think that we already see that incentive in the market. I mean, certainly one of the reasons I stopped using fossil fuels directly, of course, when I buy a product that came here from somewhere else, it may have been shipped in a fossil, but I don't use any fossil fuels in my home heating or for my transportation or for anything around my household. And of course, yes, I felt moral obligation to get off of the fuel that's primarily causing the climate crisis, but it's also saved my family a lot of money, improved quality of life, and improved health. And it's led to less energy use is what it comes back to.
Chairman Cook, the other thing when you were talking about, it could be a complex system evaluating fuels and pricing all this. So we have a model, we have models in other states on transportation fuels where it is already successfully operating. So we're going to take testimony from Oregon, the manager of the Oregon program. So we'll have some real world experience testimony on managing. I mean, it's transportation fuel, not thermal, but still the same concept. Performance-based system for transportation fuels.
It's okay if I could comment on that briefly. In Oregon for their clean fuels program, so actually this bill in a very important way is mirrored on the lessons learned and the best practices from Oregon. It's most clearly established in a new definition in the bill. This is on page 5, line 12, or subsection 8123, sub 8, in terms of the definition of fuel pathway. And so what Oregon does is they do a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions analysis based on each fuel pathway. So what's the source of the fuel? What's the production process? How much distance does it travel? They start with a nationally known model that benefits from the research at Argonne National Labs, operated by the Department of Energy, and their GREET model. And that's a starting point. Then Oregon adapts that model to say, well, okay, that's a national average in some ways. What is the travel distance to Oregon? And they adapt that. They say, what should be the effect of, what should we look at for indirect and direct land use change effects. And they have a spreadsheet. It has over 230 fuel pathways, and it generates the carbon. It's all peer reviewed, and it's based on federal labs and then Oregon's careful data analysis to say, here's the carbon intensity of these 230 fuels that are eligible or that are the baseline comparison against their program. I think the other thing that is important to note is that I do not believe what this bill envisions is assessing every individual clean heat measure for the emissions reduction that that measure achieves. We have the example of our efficiency utilities and tier 3 of the renewable energy standard, where the technical advisory group, they will do audits, they will do field testing of a number of different installations and say, on average, what is the savings? And so it doesn't create the kind of complexity and behemoth of having to know the exact emissions of every single project or installation, but based on careful field testing, audits, and reviews, saying what is the average emissions reduction for a project like this. And that's what technical advisory groups have been doing for our efficiency utilities and for tier 3 for years, and what is envisioned here as well.
So we took you a little off track. You had other things to share with us.
I recognize that I may be short on time, so I will offer to email this to the committee, but I know the question of double counting has come up again. I think it is very clear in the bill that there is no double counting allowed. There are multiple places in the bill where it actually explicitly prohibits double counting, including in 8126A5 and 8126A8. I think Mr. Cowart has explained this very well. Part of the simplicity of this program is that the Affordable Heat Act would be responsible for making sure that, as a whole, Vermont's thermal sector meets the obligations of the Global Warming Solutions Act, that 40% reduction. There was an estimate that was done in the Clean Heat Standard white paper that from the existing activity that's happening in tier 3, and this may seem like this distinction is really important. Tier 3 obligates electric utilities to reduce fossil fuel use. It is not, the performance metric for tier 3 is not emissions reduction. Emissions reduction actually doesn't show up anywhere in the regs. The performance metric for the Affordable Heat Act and the Clean Heat Standard that it would establish is greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So when Senator Bray said, you're counting different horses, I think that's exactly right. You get credit in tier 3 for fossil fuel reductions as an obligated electric utility. As an obligated fossil fuel importer that's responsible for emissions reduction, that's what's being counted. And the important point is not to figure out, but for the Affordable Heat Act, how much emissions reduction, even though that's not the direct measurement of tier 3, how much emissions reduction would those tier 3 projects have created? The estimate in the white paper was maybe it gets you 7 percentage points of the 40 percentage points you need by 2030. But the simplicity of the bill is we don't need to know whether it be 7% or 10%. We need to know that at the end of the day, it hits 40%. And everything that's already happening counts. And the bill ensures that that delta of what wouldn't have occurred gets us to 40%, whether that's an additional 30% of activity or an additional 33% of activity. I'm happy to share more on that, but I think that that has come up yet again, and I think that assertion that there is double counting is wrong, and I think that there are places in the bill that make clear why and how it's wrong, and that there's language in the bill that explicitly prohibits double counting.
So just so you'll know, I mean, I think what if allows for time for committee discussion, so why don't we go to quarter of, which gives you about 11 more minutes.
Okay.
And if you have more testimony after that, we can follow up with you and get your written testimony as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much longer. What I would say is that the difference between regulation and market transforming policy. So I feel like there is this language that is coming up around requiring and forcing. That, theoretically, there's a possibility to pass regulations that prohibit certain activities from taking place. The Clean Heat Working Group, the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee of the Climate Council as a whole did not go there because we wanted to provide the flex. We wanted to ensure that we meet the overall emissions reduction requirement and send a market signal that provides flexibility and lets people make their own choices based on their own situations. And what we find when we have a market harnessing policy is that things that don't exist now have much more of an incentive to be created or come along. So the example, and I hope that Corey Ann Wind, who is the program manager for the Clean Fuels Program in Oregon, will speak to this next week. By virtue of the clear market signal of the need to meet the obligation that their program sends, it created market activity to innovate new products and ways of delivering emissions reduction. And I think that's the kind of innovation that we want to see that is market friendly. Just want to be clear, that's what this bill is designed to do. It's not designed to say, you've got to use this technology or that technology.
When you say new products, like, so in the transportation space, what does a new product look like?
Yeah, so there has been everything from, of course, helping further incentivize EV charging, new forms of public transit, including electric buses, but there's also been innovation on the fuel side. The previous witness said there is no alternative to propane. Actually, out west, that's not true. Many folks are using renewable propane. And Mr. Koda has talked about other alternatives to propane that can be used in propane systems that are lower emitting. I've worked for years in the energy space, and one of the most important lessons I've learned is that it is always changing, and it is important to keep an open mind and be humble, especially when it comes to energy transformation and innovation. There is a lot happening in terms of research and development. Some of the best and brightest minds in the world are focusing on this global crisis, and we are seeing new technologies emerge with better efficiencies, lower emissions every year. And so, my feeling is that the goal of legislation should not be to pick winners, to say like, well, we know this technology now, so let's cement it in. It's to let the market work and continue to innovate so that we reduce emissions as we also achieve economies of scale and continue to bring costs down.
Cement is a high use of fossil fuels, so don't cement things in.
What is renewable propane?
So it's my understanding, and again, there are others who are more expert on this, including Corey Ann Wind, who I sense like from the chair we'll be hearing from shortly, is that it's similar to biodiesel in that it is a fossil fuel replacement that is made from, could be from recycled oils from restaurants, from the residue from agricultural processes that would otherwise kind of go into a waste stream. That's kind of the general answer, but I would defer to Ms. Wind for more specifics.
Yeah, it's my recollection from her testimony last year that they saw biofuels actually become cheaper by virtue of running the program, a more expensive program than an alternative. So, which was a surprise to me.
Yeah, I think oftentimes people wonder about the price effect on fossil fuels. And my recollection of her testimony is before the Clean Fuel Standard went into place, biodiesel was more expensive than diesel. And then after that program, basically internalized the cost in terms of pollution and set those obligations, those flipped. And it actually became more affordable, lower cost to, fill up a vehicle with B100 biodiesel. I mean, it depends on the fuel pathway, right? There's different types of biodiesel. Some are higher emitting than others, but the ones that are truly lower emitting, it became, they went lower in cost than the diesel. And that's the point. The point is nobody wants to increase costs. The point is to save people money, but you can't do that until we find that and incentivize the alternatives to get off of the high cost and price volatile fossil fuels. I think that's all I have for today. I will follow up with the more specific double counting testimony follow-up that I provided last year. I'll share that again.
Any more questions for Mr. Duvall? Thank you very much. So we have roughly 15 minutes or so, and I wanted to pause because we've been taking pretty solid, steady stream of testimony, but not sort of bring back, have our own conversation for a little bit. And I'm reminding myself of the question I asked way back on like day one, which was, what questions do we have and who do we need to hear from in order to answer those questions? So I don't know if people want to, my questions are mostly in the form of the flags in the bill, like to clarify something or get data on something, or get more witnesses in. But I don't know if people want to say, yeah, I would like to hear more from so-and-so, or I want to learn more about X that's in the bill. Anything on anybody's wish list? Caroline?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. I think two things that I don't necessarily want to see changes to, but I want to understand more.
Yeah.
And if it's helpful for the whole committee to hear it, that's great. If not, I'm happy to connect with Ellen or legislative council offline. But I want to understand the GREET model more. It seems to be coming up quite a bit, and I think I understand it, but then we've heard some interesting testimony from, it's opened some questions up for me. And then, so specifically under, it would be page 17 of the bill as introduced, the emissions schedule piece. And then I did have a question around.
Sorry, can I, just to make
Oh,
sure I
yeah.
understand that, so we will line somebody up. Some of the back and forth I've heard about GREET is that it may not, it's not exactly applicable to us because it's a transportation
Exactly.
standard or process tag rather than a heating tag. Is it that kind of thing? Like, how useful is it to us?
That's exactly it, because I don't understand the criticism. So either the criticism is invalid or I don't have enough information to understand it. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, thank you.
I'm always trying to make sure that if I have a strong opinion, that at least it's not wrong. And then Senator McCormick and I had the pleasure of having a coffee hour over the weekend with some constituents. And the question of renewable natural gas in the bill came up. And I believe we have testimony coming from Vermont Gas Systems at some point, but just to kind of understand what that looks like and what the language of this bill, which I feel already addresses renewable natural gas sufficiently, what this bill would do for that marketplace. And then that's it. I think the bill is phenomenal.
That was this weekend.
I know.
What did we do?
It was Saturday.
Seems like it was 3 weeks ago.
All right.
This session, to me, feels like we're at week 6 already or something like that. Okay, great, that's very helpful. So we'll have testimony on both. Some more about who else can help us, but Ms. Wynn from Oregon has a lot of experience with GREET and then the adapting of GREET to data that Oregon already has. And some of it's going to be, in our case, that we'll start with a generic model and get Vermont specific data in order to let the tag really do its work. So we need to know more about that. It'd be good to know more
Yes, that sounds good. And, you know, we did hear from Rights and Democracy around the tag group and the renters, but it sounds like you're thinking about that and how we can address it, so.
Yeah, I mean, the bill doesn't speak directly to renters,
Yeah.
and so, but it does, in that, well, it addresses it, in, I think, at least in two ways. One is that, for those who are low income and renting, that they're already a named group for receiving services. And amongst the service received, at least half of it has to be infrastructure specific, not just that you supply biofuels in order to reduce the emissions there, so that there's a tangible gain. The challenge, is, as you know, is before, will a landlord who doesn't pay for heat bother to make the investment? And the RAP program that Laura was talking about, I think is, the most promising thing we've been able to figure out in the last 2 years. I hope that $10 million set aside for it, or 9, I can't remember which it was, that the initial revolving loan fund gets depleted because we have enough people sign up and we use the money, and then we start having two things. It does come back in terms of loans, so it gets recharged. But I also hope that at that point, we would see the success there that would motivate us to find another tranche of money to recapitalize the fund.
I mean, Vermont is trying to crack, and the rest of the nation's trying to crack with renters. It would be really incredible if we were able to do some work on it, because we have, I think, the right scale to be a model for the nation on this. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, besides the whole dynamics of how the program could work, it's also exciting because we saw it in small, when we took testimony, we saw it in some small utilities. And it was just utility specific. It was never a statewide program. So the other thing that's exciting to me about that is that there's equity in one building. Okay. Anyone else have something to dig into?
Well, I just want to say, I do have several questions, but they're all for folks that I think we're gonna hear from. So there's.
Well, just for making sure.
Yeah, so
Who do you want to hear from?
obviously the PUC, I'm very interested to chat with them. I am interested to hear from some fuel dealers. I think we are, my understanding is we are gonna hear from some fuel dealers. And I'm glad to see LIHEAP is on the schedule. I have some questions about some implications for LIHEAP. And I do, sort of following up on what Senator White was saying, you're thinking about renters, and so interested to have Laura Collins back to just have, have her finish her testimony, but also continue that conversation, and if there's some opportunity around that. So yeah, I mean, there's other questions I have, but I think those are those are my priority folks right now. Yeah.
And can you remind me, so what kind of questions are hanging over in your mind based on Ms. Collins's testimony?
Well, so particularly around if she has any strategic ideas around how to address renters, and maybe she doesn't, but
she did email us some specific things over the weekend that could.
I'm not check that out.
I don't know if she sent it to the whole committee, but I'm happy to. I'm happy to share it out if not.
Cool.
Great, thank you.
And plus, like, if she had, I know she was kind of rushed at the end, so if she, had other things to say, just want to make sure that we fully hear from her. So, great.
Okay. Senator McCormick, anything in your mind, like, hey, I'd like to know more about this before we keep going?
I've already made my little speech, but just to encapsulate, as we explore ways that cleaner ways of generating energy, I'll hope we will keep our focus on requiring less energy in the first place.
Yeah, I think to that point, we have Efficiency Vermont coming on Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people get wrapped around the axle, I know I do, of thinking about, is this am I becoming more efficient or am I conserving, you know? Okay, let me see, conserving is I make fewer trips into Middlebury and I gain my errands up, but efficiency is I can get a car that gets better gas mileage or I can wait. I can talk myself into more than that.
And also the conversation of trying to encourage train travel as opposed to automobile. People often resist the idea of train by comparing it to automobile minute for minute. And then I'll take the train when I get to New York as quickly as I drive. Otherwise, you're asking me to do something ridiculous.
If it was
That's the big attitude you get, yeah.
If it were a tie, I think I'd take the train because I find it really hard to walk around inside my car, stretch my legs. I put down on my list to learn more about the IRA money.
Oh,
IRA. From JFO, so I asked JFO to come in and help us. And then Senator Kitchell mentioned to me that she had heard from the treasurer and the treasurer's office may be digging into the IRA money as well. So, and then also we have Dane Riley from Efficiency Vermont coming in next week. And he himself within Efficiency Vermont, I think, is becoming their IRA money specialist. So we can maybe get double duty. He's become S5, but maybe he can also help us look at the IRA funding. And the reason I bring it up is my understanding now is the bill accommodates that money well by helping people get into programs or take clean measures that draw down that sort of money. But I would, if there's a chance to make the bill more explicit or more accommodating or enhance our ability to bring in IRA money, then I'm not sure that we need to make a change, but I'd just like to dot the i's and cross the t's on that one. Senator McDonald, anything on your wish list that relates to this bill?
Yeah, I was listening to Mr. Coda's testimony last week, where he was concerned that we would be denying his industry to the opportunity to provide fossil fuels that were less polluting. And I think we're splitting hairs when we allow that.
Okay, so I'm just to make sure I'm following that you can, are we talking about clean heat credits, like what earns you a clean heat credit, or?
It's like saying, whenever I come up with an analogy, I always get myself in trouble. It's like, you don't get the death penalty if you murder half as many people as the last person that got the death penalty.
Thinking that is going to be a stretch for me to apply that to this bill. Let me see. What are you thinking? But
I was also tossed off track just a little bit by that Smith's initial testimony, and not because she started out talking about it's our goal to preserve forest land and to preserve prime agricultural land. And our policy in here has been, oh, you want to use some agricultural land? We'll only use half as much. Everybody wants to build on prime agricultural land because it's cheaper, less expensive, easier to build. And then we let them do it. And kind of reverse notion. Every day walking halfway to Moscow, you never get there. But if you, every day you give up half your agricultural land, you'll starve to death before it's all gone. I don't know how we constantly do that in the interests of being fair and I was gonna say, being good old boys.
Well,
Which itself is a
you know,
departure.
I did say something along the lines of she didn't think that Act 134 was working as intended, which remember when we did that bill, it was if a town wrote if their town plan included a renewable energy element that was in concert with the state's energy goal, then that town plan could receive a certification from the RPC or the Department of Public Service. And then if they participate in a public utility commission hearing for someone to apply for CPG to do a solar field in their town, they should be given substantial deficit by CPC, rather than if they don't have such an approved plan, they get due consideration. And if you remember our meeting in room 11 where we had, I don't know, scores and scores of witnesses, and they said due consideration seems like not any consideration. Because they seemed like they were batting zero. That was what they were feeling like, as opposed to batting at least 500 or something. So that's when we gave them that opportunity. I heard mixed reviews on how well Act 174 has been working. So make a note to self, follow up on our own work and see if that could come back into the back where we started. That could have an impact on protecting primary soils. If a town said our preferred areas for development exclude primary soils, and now here's a project coming along that wants to build on primary soils. How does that? How do those competing interests get resolved?
Oh, but the soils are it's gonna be a hospital there, it's gonna be great for healthcare. There'll be an elementary school there. There'll be an interchange exit there because interstates use less gas than other roads. There's always a reason. There's always a reason to do something that is contrary to what we say are intent.
Sounds like you've been to a hearing, sounds like you've been to a hearing or two. Like at the Randolph exit. Okay. So thank you. Anything else for our wish list, to-do list, testimony list, guest list? Okay, well, that's very helpful. So thank you. We are